inspired by real-life events. Imtiaz grew up in the quieter side of Rangpur, where life did not feel cinematic in the beginning, but instead felt repetitive, slow, and heavy in a way that only people living inside it could truly understand. And from childhood, he noticed something strange about his surroundings. That everyone seemed to be preparing not for dreams, but for survival. As if life itself was a test of endurance rather than possibility. And his father was a strict but honest man who worked long hours in a small workshop repairing machines and earning just enough to keep the household running. Never complaining, but always carrying a tired silence in his shoulders, while his mother lived her entire life managing scarcity with dignity, turning small amounts into enough through careful planning and emotional strength that Imtiaz understood much later in life. And growing up in that environment shaped him quietly, not through big events but through repeated exposure to responsibility. And in school, he was an average student, not celebrated, not ignored, just present in the middle of everything. Observing more than participating, often thinking about life beyond what was immediately visible. And that thinking slowly turned into imagination, and imaginations slowly turned into a restless desire for something more than routine. And after completing his studies, he reached a moment where life forced him to make a decision that would define everything that followed. Because two paths appeared at the same time. One was a stable local job with fixed salary, predictable future, and social approval, and the other was an uncertain startup opportunity in the city that had no guarantees, no structure, only ambition and risk and uncertainty wrapped together like a question without an answer. And for many days, Imtiaz stayed silent about his confusion, carrying both options inside his mind like two different versions of himself, pulling in opposite directions. And people around him advised safety, saying stability was the smartest choice. But inside him, something resisted that idea. Not loudly, but persistently, like a quiet voice refusing to disappear. And one evening, he sat with his father outside their home under dim light, listening to the sound of distant traffic mixing with silence, and he asked carefully, "Abu, what if I fail? If I take the risky path and lose everything?" And his father did not answer immediately, because he understood the weight of such questions. And after a long pause, he said, "Failure is painful, but regret lasts longer. And at least failure means you tried something real." And those words stayed inside Imtiaz like something permanent. And after nights of thinking, hesitation, and emotional conflict, he finally chose the startup, stepping into a world that felt unfamiliar from the first moment. Because the office in the city was small, the environment was unstable, the team was young and learning through mistakes, and nothing felt fully formed, not even the direction they were heading in. And in the beginning, Imtiaz tried to adapt quickly, working long hours, learning everything he could, trying to prove himself through effort and consistency. But slowly, he realized that effort alone does not guarantee clarity. And there were nights when he returned to his rented room, exhausted, sitting in silence, staring at the ceiling fan, moving endlessly, as if time itself was repeating. And during those moments, he questioned whether he had chosen growth or simply replaced comfort with struggle. And he often thought about home, about his mother's careful hands, preparing meals within limits, about his father's tired back returning late from work, and guilt would mix with ambition inside him, creating emotions he could not easily separate. And in the startup, he met people like Farhan, Imran, and Sohail, each carrying their own uncertainties, and together they formed a fragile system trying to build something meaningful from chaos. And often they would sit late at night, surrounded by unfinished ideas, empty cups, and whiteboards filled with half-developed plans. And Imran once said with a tired smile, "If this works, people will call us visionaries, and if it fails, we will just become another forgotten attempt." And that sentence stayed in their silence longer than the laughter that followed it. And as months passed, the startup entered a difficult phase where financial pressure increased. Clients became inconsistent, and uncertainty slowly turned into a daily emotional weight that everyone carried differently. And Imtiaz became quieter, more reflective, sometimes isolating himself to think deeply before making decisions, because he understood that panic creates noise, but clarity requires silence. And during this time, his family back home also began facing hidden difficulties, especially his father, whose health started weakening due to years of continuous physical labor. Though he never openly complained, and Imtiaz would often call home, trying to sound normal, hearing reassurances that everything was fine, not realizing that those reassurances were often given to protect him from distraction. Until one night, everything changed when his phone rang late and his mother's voice came through trembling and unstable, saying, "Your father collapsed today." And in that moment, everything inside Imtiaz froze, because suddenly deadlines, meetings, and ambitions felt meaningless compared to the fear of losing someone who had been the silent foundation of his life. And he rushed back home immediately, traveling through a journey that felt longer than distance itself. And when he reached the hospital and saw his father lying weak, connected to machines, breathing slowly, Imtiaz felt a version of himself break in a way he could not describe, because strength he always associated with his father now looked fragile, human, and temporary. And he held his father's hand, feeling the weight of years of sacrifice inside that single touch. And his father slowly opened his eyes and said softly, "Don't stop your path because of me. Just make it meaningful." And those words carried both pain and acceptance. And after days of uncertainty, his father's condition stabilized but never fully returned to what it once was. And Imtiaz went back to the city carrying a different kind of responsibility inside him, one that made every decision heavier and every failure sharper. And the startup soon reached its most critical phase, where shutting down felt like a realistic possibility. And one rainy night, when the office was nearly empty and silence filled every corner, Imtiaz sat with Fahan and Imran, listening to the rain hitting the glass like a slow rhythm of uncertainty. And Fahan said quietly, "Maybe this is where most stories end." And Imran added after a pause, "Or maybe this is where real stories begin." And Imtiaz stayed silent for a long time, feeling everything he had lived until that moment collide inside him. The struggle, the fear, the responsibility, the hope. And then he said slowly, "If we stop now, everything we suffered becomes just pain. But if we continue, even failure becomes meaning." And that night, they did not quit. Instead, they rebuilt everything from the ground up, rethinking strategy, restructuring operations, learning from every mistake instead of hiding from it. And slowly, step by step, things began to stabilize. Not suddenly, but gradually, like light returning after a long darkness, and years passed with continuous effort. And Imtiaz changed deeply through that journey, becoming more patient, more grounded, more aware that success is not a destination, but a process of surviving uncertainty with discipline. And one evening, after a long day, he stood on the with Farhan and Imran, watching the city lights stretch endlessly into the distance. And Imran said quietly, "We almost gave up so many times." And Imtiaz replied with calm certainty, "Yes, but every time we continued, we built a stronger version of ourselves." And in that moment, he understood something permanent, that life is not defined by the ease of the path, but by the decision to keep walking. When the path becomes unclear, and every hardship carries a lesson that only time reveals, and every choice creates a version of yourself that you only meet later. And as the wind moved through the city, he realized that true strength is not avoiding collapse, but rebuilding after it. And the real meaning of life is not found in escaping struggle, but in transforming it into direction. Because, in the end, a person is not measured by how safely they lived, but by how honestly they endured and still chose to build something meaningful from what remained. And that understanding stayed with Imtiaz like a quiet truth that never needed to be spoken again, reminding him that every ending people fear is often just the beginning of finally becoming who they were meant to be all along.